Kia ora YouTube. This is clearly no longer a strength training channel. This is now an late diagnosis ADHD info dump in which we trauma bond over our shared experience, and I'm kind of here for it.
Rip and tear until it is done.
But in all fairness, this YouTube channel has always supposed to be more about like all of me as a whole. And one of the things that I'm good at, which makes me a good strength coach, is also my ability to like educate and inform and put things in perspective for people, right? I think there's a huge overlap as being a trainer and just basically working through almost anything with someone. Like coaching is coaching. And the ADHD stuff especially seems to overlap with my skill sets quite well, because even as a strength coach, I've always approached everything with a high level of empathy, right? I am a very feelings-based person. I have a very feelings-based coaching style. And yeah, that's why I think I'm able to find this connection with all of you other adults with ADHD and communicate a lot of the feelings you have, because that is how I've always approached everything, right? As a coach, and I've had to apply it to myself with dealing with my own ADHD diagnosis. One of the things from the previous videos that I touched on that I really wanted to kind of extend on, because it seemed to really resonate with a lot of people, was the grief period post-diagnosis and kind of how it all feels and how it is to work through this very strange change in your life, right? You have such a massive paradigm shift. A lot of your core memories and ideas are recontextualized by this diagnosis, and it can kind of like throw you into a bit of a head spin. Being diagnosed with ADHD as an adult is 100% a canon event, right? Like it is a marker in your life. And therefore you've got this like pre-diagnosis persona and this post-diagnosis persona, because so many things change. And I like to look at it as like two Damiens, and I really did love and had a relationship with pre-diagnosis Damien, but that has had to come to an end. And as with the end of any relationship, it comes with a mourning process. And I find that the 5 stages of grief is actually a really good way of looking at what the journey has been with dealing with being diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. So people are kind of familiar with the 5 stages of grief when it comes to normally mourning the death of a loved one, but I think that they hold particularly true for the grieving process that I'll say that comes along post-diagnosis. So what exactly are the 5 stages of grief? I wrote them down because there's no way I'm going to remember this all off the top of my head. So the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. I would very much say I'm in the final stage, this acceptance stage, but let me like walk you through one by one on how I think these applied to my journey. So the first stage of the process is denial. And I would say that this is applicable to when you're at the point where you're thinking about getting diagnosed, right? There's all these little indicators that you're slowly becoming aware that you might be a person that has ADHD, and you know, it seems like it might be a solution to all of the problems and like the little things that have never quite added up to your life. And the denial kicks in a very weird way. Well, at least it did for me. It wasn't that I was in denial all the time. It's almost like, say this is where I started the process of looking at a diagnosis, and this is where the diagnosis was. As I headed closer and closer towards the diagnosis, the more I was convincing myself that it wasn't, that I was wrong, that I had got it completely incorrect. And I have a few theories on why this is. As we know, with ADHD, you have, especially when you get diagnosed later, you've got a lot of like reinforced ideas about being lazy. You tend to develop like rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And because of this, you feel like you're again just making excuses for why you can't do normal things, right? You've got all those societal pressures and essentially brainwashing that's just been telling you that you're lazy and you procrastinate and you just need to make a list and you just are disorganized and all this kind of stuff, right? So as you approach closer and closer to the diagnosis, those voices get louder and louder and louder, and you almost do go into denial that this is a problem and that you aren't just overreacting or being overly sensitive or whatever these awful things you've been told your entire life are, right? The funny thing was, even when I was at the point of being diagnosed, when I was at the doctor, you do what's called like a TOVA test, right? Which is an attention test. And it's this very boring thing where you got to try to react to a dot on a screen. If you've been diagnosed, you might know what I'm talking about. And while this test was happening, I was like, I'm really good at video games and I'm fairly sure I'm nailing this test because it's just like reactive. It's seeing how much attention you can have. So I am busy gaslighting myself that I'm doing well in this test while I'm doing it because I'm like, this test isn't going to work on me. I've played too many video games. I'm good at like reactive shooting. And then when the test actually came out and the doctor showed my reactive timing of like my inattentiveness kicking in over and over in these gigantic waves, he was like, you don't just have ADHD, you've got pretty severe ADHD. So even up to the point of me experiencing my ADHD, my brain, from all the bullshit I'd been told over the years about me just being lazy, was still kind of putting me into the state of denial. The funny thing as well is when you start the process of being diagnosed, you might talk to a few friends, coworkers, families, and they very quickly try to diminish your experience. Like you hear it all the time. Like, I think we're all a little bit on the spectrum. Like, oh yeah, I have all these things. So it's very difficult to not go into a state of denial when every single external person and input is kind of telling you that you're making a big deal out of nothing. So it does kind of wear on you and you enter this stage of denial until the diagnosis comes in. And then for me, at least when I saw all like the TOVA test stuff, maybe I'll put a picture up of my TOVA test over here. It became real because I had like data and maybe I needed to see that. But that was like one of the ways that helped me get through this point of denial. So the second stage of grief is anger. And I would say that because this is actually a diagnosis and not just the death of something, I was penduluming between anger and relief, right? Like I finally had this answer to this like question, this like inner monologue that had been running through my head as I had been masking my way through every single situation on why I felt like I didn't fit in, why I couldn't do certain things, especially when I first took Ritalin. And I experienced the calmness of like a neurotypical mind. And I was amazed at the fact that this is what like a brain is supposed to feel like. This is what a reasonable level of sensory input feels like. How much easier it was to navigate. So the anger that came with that was the fact that I had had all these people in my life judging me this entire time when this is what they were experiencing, right? Like I've said in the past, it was like I've been playing life on the hardest difficulty this entire time while everyone's been playing on easy mode. So I would get this sense of relief that, it wasn't just me, life can be easier. But then I'd also get this sense of anger that I had faced so much judgment surrounding the way I was. But then also a little bit of pride that I had made it this far, given the difficulty I was having with my ADHD clearly throughout my entire life, which then would come to the second reason I became quite angry. Like the second reason why I feel like I felt anger is, while I'm a grown-ass man now, I'm 36 years old, believe it or not, at some point I was a child. And when I was a child, I definitely exhibited a range of things that would imply that I have ADHD. As any child, there were authoritative adults in my world that were supposed to be like looking out for me. And instead of looking out for me, they had kind of seen all these traits and decided that like I was lazy and I procrastinated and all the things you've heard a million times if you have ADHD. And it was rather drilled into me in a negative thing that still has consequences on my mind state to this day in how I approach the world, rather than realizing I have ADHD. Because in hindsight, it seems so obvious that I have ADHD. Like that's the thing that's frustrating. You can see I'm getting angry about it thinking right now. And I don't blame my parents or anything like that, because like they didn't know, but surely there was enough people in my life that had given me the same critiques to have picked up that something was going on. Instead, I was always looked at as a gifted kid that's never living up to their potential, right? But at the same time, I'm also always getting upset that I'm not living up to my potential. So it's clear as day that something was going on. And I think that our tamariki these days have a much better system in place to catch these things earlier. But yeah, so that was one of the reasons that made me angry. It's like looking back on hindsight, getting really furious about how easy it is for people that aren't neurodiverse, as well as getting angry at all the times it should have been picked up and wasn't. Whew, I need a breather after that. That made me just pretty angry even thinking about it. But all right. The next stage of grief is bargaining. And this came in the form of once you've kind of worked through the anger, worked through the relief, all that kind of stuff, you are like, I need to figure out my way forwards, right? So you start thinking in a way that now that I have a grip that I have ADHD and the medication is making me feel more normal, I can fix my past, right? Because you're still kind of jolted by this pre and post phase in your life that's going on. So you start bargaining that you can fix your past, that you can fix all the things that you have broken, and that you will do whatever it takes to course correct and catch up, and that all those years of being lazy you can now make up for in like a burst of energy and focus that you've never had before, and that you will play catch up, and that from now on, as long as you are aware of it and you're taking your medication, you promise that you can be normal and you can fit in with society, and all of these problems that you had prior to your diagnosis, you don't have to worry about it, because you promise that you will now conform to the neurotypical world that you exist in, right? Like that's the bargaining. You're like, I recognize that I'm different to this world, and I can use this medication to now fit my round peg into your square hole. And I promise, as long as you accept me for what I am, like I can work within this world. And that's what I'd say is like the bargaining thing, that you are now going to be normal because you are diagnosed and you might be medicated, right? You bargain with all those voices in your head that have kind of worn you out over the years, telling you that you're, again, lazy. This is going to come up all the time because that's me personally, that you are lazy, but you're like, I can fix this. I can see where you're coming from. It was the ADHD. We have a reason, and I bow forwards to you to say sorry, and I'm going to fix my life. But unfortunately, like the ADHD doesn't go away just because you know it's there. And because this bargaining process is quite intense and strips you down to your most vulnerable sense, and then you can still find that your ADHD crops up and acts as a barrier, it leads to the fourth stage of grief, and that is depression. And I think this is the one that resonated with a lot of people. It's when you begin to realize that you can't fix the past, and you start mourning for all the time that you've lost over the years, all the opportunities that slipped through your fingers at the last moment because you couldn't quite finish a task, all the friendships and relationships that didn't work out because you could never be your true self. You were like behind a mask, and when that mask slipped and people saw how stressed and anxious you were, they thought you were weird and overreacting, and that would make you put up the mask even more in a bid to fit in with people that you never were truly going to fit in with because your brain chemistry just was never the same. The lost time is difficult because that's something you can't get back. There is no making up for it. And working as hard as you can because you feel like you're having to play catch up feels like it's stealing more time away from you. And that can be depressing as hell as well. For me, there's some real pre-diagnosis issues that maintain a problem in my life to this day. Like I've got like some issues with like taxes and finance stuff, like holes I dug for myself because of my ADHD being untreated that I can manage now, but the holes are so deep, I'm still trying to make my way out of it. So I still have these consequences, and I find that very depressing because that's still holding me back. And you kind of feel like you deserve a clean slate because you didn't have the same starting point as everyone else. And that makes you very, very sad. And then while this is all happening, and while the initial relief and everything has kind of passed, you realize that even if you're medicated, the ADHD symptoms never truly fully go away. So you're still struggling with stuff, right? Like you're still struggling to do stuff that normal people can do somewhat easily. You're still not developing good habits. You're just now aware that the ADHD is the reason why you can't do it. Which brings us up to the final stage of grief, which is acceptance. Acceptance is the point of the diagnosis, which literally took me almost 2 years to get to, I would say, in which you realize like you have ADHD, so you're aware of it, and you're starting to put together the pieces of the positives and negatives of it. I personally hate it when people say ADHD is my superpower because like it kind of undermines a lot of our experiences, I think, right? Like, yeah, well done, you can hyper-focus, congratulations, it's pretty destructive in other means, right? And I think accepting it for what it is a better response to it, right? Like I'm all about being positive about everything, but it is debilitating. You know, you have to accept it. And part of this acceptance stage is working with the ADHD, not against it. You're not trying to be a neurotypical person now that you're able to understand the differences between your brain and theirs. You are accepting that you aren't a neurotypical person. So what that looks like for me is, yeah, there are things that make me really good with my ADHD. I've said this a million times, like I'm very creative. I like innovative problem solving. I'm good at being solution driven when backed into a corner, working under pressure, working under stress, but I still am messy. I'm still not very good at managing money. There's a bunch of things. And what used to happen was I would see that I'm not good at, say, paying bills, and I'd be like, it's not even a difficult thing to do, Damien, just pay your bills. I can now be like, this barrier is set up by ADHD, and although I can see that the task is easy, I know I'm not going to do it. So I have to put things in place, in my case, my lovely wife, to make sure that these things are being done and then not judge myself for not doing simple things. Because for me, it's always been the simple things that add up to and snowball and end up being destructive. Simple things, like I said, paying bills, answering emails, little things like that, right? So it's getting all of these energy sinks out of my life and giving them to someone or creating systems that look after them that don't have the same, it doesn't take as much away from them as it does for me, while allowing me to focus on the things that I'm really good at. Like I said, I'm very privileged to have a super supportive wife that does do it, but I think communicating to people that you're working and collaborating with to share workload is probably one of the best things, right? So that is like accepting how your ADHD works, because while you might think that you're unloading on people, the chances are your ADHD allows you to do something for them that they find very stressful, but you get like a little bit of a dopamine stimulus from, and therefore it's easier for you to do. So it's finding that middle ground. So accepting the ADHD and working with it, realizing that there are things that if you haven't developed a way of managing them by now, you might never, and that's okay. Just accept that even though it may seem weird to other people that you can't do it, it's not a character flaw. It is just part of the barriers set up by your pesky, pesky little neurospicy brain. Once you've learned to accept it and you've learned to start removing the judgment out of some of the things you find difficult, then your life can become much more sustainable. And it will have its ups and downs. You will get frustrated, but that's just part of the journey. And I'm still learning every day. Like I said, I'm by no means a counselor. I'm not bloody qualified in talking about ADHD. So I would like to really point out that a lot of this is based on my own experiences, and yours might be completely different. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. I'm probably going to do some training stuff coming up just because I need a little bit of a breather from this ADHD stuff, because while I love it, it can be emotionally quite draining on me. But I hope you guys get something out of it. If you're into training and you have ADHD, maybe pick up one of these attention deficit hypertrophy disorder teas. And yeah, look up our app, head to my website.